The legacy media has long claimed to give a voice to the afflicted and the powerless. But journalist Rachel Emmanuel, formerly of the Canadian mainstream digital newspaper iPolitics, found the opposite to be true. Repeatedly told not to air certain perspectives, Emmanuel resigned after editors changed information in an article she wrote due to pressure from the Canadian Deputy Prime Minister's office. Emmanuel joins us now to discuss the incidents that led to her resignation, as well as the pattern in legacy media of only providing a platform for one perspective. Rachel, welcome back to Washington Watch.
Thanks for having me back. Happy to be here.
I'm so glad to have you. Tell us your story briefly. What is it that led you to feel like you had to resign?
Sure. So I think throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, especially here in Canada, we've seen pretty crazy government overreach. We've seen severe curtailment of civil liberties. And this was something that caught my attention and that I was concerned about. And I was speaking to Canadians who were also concerned about it. So as a reporter, I was efforting to write about these topics, and I experienced pretty severe pushback from my editorial team, basically saying, we think that it's just a small number of Canadians who feel this way, specifically on things like vaccine mandates and lockdowns. And they asked me to sort of stop covering these issues and to stop engaging with sources that share these perspectives. As well, as you well know, during the COVID-19 pandemic, we had many prominent doctors who were coming out against some of the science, which was sort of changing all the time, and saying, we don't agree with the government recommendations. And I was told to pretty much rely on the government science that was coming down and not to engage with other experts. So all of these things were very frustrating for me and led me to sort of look for employment elsewhere. And I had begun the process of this when an article that I had written was heavily edited by an editor post-publication. And I didn't get a chance to review the edits that were made to the article. They were just changed without my knowledge. And I did not agree with the changes that were made. I did not consent to them. So that made it very clear to me that I had to leave and find work elsewhere, and that it was time to sever ties with the mainstream media once and for all.
Now, Rachel, you say that your editors expressed their concern that these positions were held only by a small number of people. Therefore, they didn't warrant being expressed or given a voice. In your perspective, why does it matter to them that only a small number feel a particular way? Why weren't they more concerned about whether the questions or concerns had any validity?
Sure, that's an excellent question. It's one that I've wrestled with a lot. I think one of the things that I've noticed is people in mainstream media just maybe have like a smaller network of friends, and they just don't necessarily share perspectives that are outside the mainstream media. So as I was hearing from a lot of Canadians who were very concerned about the government overreach, maybe people in the mainstream media weren't, and certainly my editors hadn't been hearing this from people. So when I was presenting a different perspective, they tended to think that it really wasn't that many people at all, but also almost that those perspectives didn't matter because they found them to be so radical. Certainly another barrier that I faced was during a period of the most significant government overreach in Canada. The official opposition, the Conservative Party here in Canada, wasn't really speaking out against it. So there was periods when I only had maybe one independent MP to rely on for comment to speak out against these measures. So it did make it seem like it was quite a small number of people for a period. But what we saw, obviously, with the Freedom Convoy here in Ottawa is that Canadians are extremely frustrated with the government overreach that we have seen during the COVID-19 pandemic, and everybody wants to get back to some sense of normalcy.
Now, when you were bringing alternative perspectives and perhaps medical perspectives that were different than the government's narrative, were they at all interested in finding out if these people were credible, if the complaints and the concerns they were expressing were credible, or was it simply the fact that we don't hear this from many people, therefore we're going to ignore them?
There was absolutely a lot of hesitation when it came to medical stuff. I think part of the thing was you don't have a lot of medical experts within the media. You might have a couple journalists that are experts in sort of the health beats, but otherwise it's journalists, who are typically good at writing and figuring out the facts, all of a sudden presented with a new subject matter. Probably one of the faults of having an industry that is so much more short-staffed, and we just have less people doing more work than we ever used to. You don't have people that are really experts in beats like we used to. So I think there was just a general fear that we don't want to be seen as propagating false science or false information. So let's just avoid wading into those topics altogether.
So do you think one of the concerns many of us have with legacy media is a function of just a lack of resources rather than a lack of interest in the truth?
There is absolutely a concern with the lack of resources, but there's a bigger concern with the lack of perspectives. You have a lot of people who agree with each other and who are writing the same thing over and over, and you don't have very many people within the mainstream media that are offering different opinions or writing stories in different way and incorporating different voices. Certainly, that was one of the reasons that I had attempted to stay and work into mainstream media as long as I did, till I eventually said, this isn't working because I can't write the stories that are important to me. And when I do write them, they're so heavily edited that I don't even think it's my voice, and I'm not proud of it, and I don't want my name on it, that it's just easier for me not to write these stories. So I would say the bigger issue is that we just don't have a large variety of voices within the mainstream media. We don't have different perspectives. And certainly when there are different voices within the mainstream media, they leave because it's so difficult for them to do their job in a way that they can feel is following their principles.
Rachel, we've only got about 30 seconds left, but how do we restore trust in media so people believe what they're being told again?
It's a really good question. I think the big thing right now is media actually needs to be willing to look at themselves and look inwardly and say, people don't trust us. What's going on? I think when people don't trust the media, and the media kind of gets their backs up about it and almost wears it as a badge of honor that they're doing their jobs correctly. And they point their fingers at politicians who don't trust them. And they point their fingers at alternative and independent media who point out the inconsistencies in mainstream media. There doesn't seem to be a lot of actual reflection as to saying, why doesn't the public trust us? What can we do better? What are we missing?
Rachel Emmanuel, we appreciate your courage as well as your time today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me again.